I think people always like, especially in financial markets, tend to like ascribe like causation to things that are just correlated. So like I always think like when I think back around all the like crazy controversy about like shutting down the nouns Discord, like it seems probable to me that like people feel very like bad about it because they somehow like associate like the NFT asset price going down with the closing of the Discord as though like that was the catalyst. And I mean, I think the reason prices went down is because there was a giant asset bubble and the bubble burst. But I think your point is right on about like the attention meritocracy. I do think that, like in part, it's like an unsolved problem. Like how do you actually coordinate the social layer for these like permissionless
Yeah.
orgs? But in part, like you never get to attempt to solve the problem if you're just like if everyone's just congregating in one sort of like centrally moderated place.
Well,
And it's not even like nouns is of course not the first time it happened. I don't know like if you were around in the old days of Bitcoin, but like
yeah,
the sort
unfortunately,
of
I was
like
not.
fracturing of like, okay, yeah, I mean so they're essentially like all of Bitcoin for the most part was happening on the r Bitcoin subreddit, and eventually there was like a ton of censorship on that subreddit that caused like I think like people sort of underestimate the extent to which the sort of like censorship and moderation on the Bitcoin subreddit like contributed to the Bitcoin Cash fork. But it's a great example of like
Yeah.
the like if you just have this sort of like single point of communication, whoever's kind of in charge of that communication eventually becomes like super powerful in the context of the protocol. So yeah, it has to be a
One
meritocracy.
hundred
Like
percent.
people just yeah,
Yeah.
that's the only way it can work.
And like there are so many sort of decentralized organizations that have very centralized comms layer, right? So I guess that's why today's conversation is interesting, because probably for the first time in history of Web3, we are very close to a point where we can have a almost decentralized communication layer on for different types of communities, leveraging Farcaster. But I guess I want to talk very quickly about logistics before we actually officially get started. Sorry. So for people on the web, you may be able to see this chat function, but you're not able to reply directly there. So you can reply to the chat on any other Farcaster client, either directly on Webcast or on the AlphaCaster app, which is now called Abura. The second point is this conversation will be recorded and posted on Farcaster later. And then lastly, if you want to speak or want to post questions, you can directly raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat, and I'll get to it as much as I can. Today we have about 30 to 40 minutes. There are a lot of topics that we want to go through. We were talking about Farcaster, which we'll get back to in just a second. But I guess I do want to touch on, if you don't mind, 4556, the topic that is on everyone's mind recently, which is the burn mechanism. I think there has been a lot of discussion recently on both Twitter and Farcaster. But could you talk a bit about the implication of this new primitive and what kind of forcing function it is going to create? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. And I mean, for context here, this is not my invention.
Sure.
This I believe kind of originated. I guess I had always sort of like talked about like burning ETH as a kind of like underexplored primitive in the crypto ecosystem. But I think Wilson Cusack was the one who sort of like
Sure.
suggested this as like a solution for nouns. And I don't have a fully formed opinion on it yet, or at least like a high conviction opinion. I think it's probably a good idea. I think it probably corrects a sort of like it corrects a problem with the incentives that sort of like existed from the outset when we started working on nouns. I think, of course, like at the time we were building nouns, there was no way to kind of to sort of see far enough ahead to understand what would happen with the whole kind of like book value, NFT value set of problems. And so I think the idea that the protocol should have baked into it like a forcing function for spending it's probably a correct intuition, and attempting to implement it and see what happens is probably the right thing to do at this point.
ETH that could have been spent on public goods, right? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the way I like to think about it is like burning ETH in a sense is the public good of last resort, right? Like I think in general the idea that like burning ETH is like kind of equivalent to like torching money is it's maybe like a bit of a, I don't know, skeuomorphism, whatever you want to call it, like a holdover from the fiat world, right? Like in like a decentralized currency where the money supply is kind of like algorithmic, like permanently removing a piece of the money supply is kind of like equivalent to redistributing it to all the other sort of participants in the economy. So in that sense, burning is really this sort of like redistribution mechanism. It's a wealth redistribution mechanism, and so it's kind of equivalent to increasing the value of the ETH for every single other ETH holder. And to the extent that you think Ethereum is good, which I think is a reasonable assumption given that we're all here, then you can sort of like think of burning as like the most basic form of public good, and maybe the most fair one that's possible to implement kind of in the Ethereum ecosystem. And so I think that is probably the correct way to think about it. And it really becomes just an interesting mechanic that can be a forcing function for spending. And I think it's the case that if we do implement this, it's probably fairly unlikely that a lot of ETH ever really gets burned. It's probably more likely that it exists as a sort of deterrent around failing to spend, and a deterrent for arbitrage. But ultimately, I think it looks a little bit like the prop house or another function where essentially you're kind of forcing like an auction to happen on the DAO's ETH, and the bids will eventually come in the form of proposals, and the DAO will likely pick the best proposal, which will lead to the ETH probably not being burned. I think a lot of people have sort of like pushed back on the burn and said, well, instead of burning it, why don't you donate it to charity X or Y?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a really nice illustration of like the sort of like the neutrality of burning, right? Like the reason it's good to burn is because it's kind of like the most neutral, most fair sort of in protocol public good, and I think it's great if people want to create proposals to donate to charity X or Y in lieu of burning, but kind of underlying everything, there's always that sort of like threat of burn, the threat of like the public good of last resort. So you have to do better than the last resort, and that's the nice reason to implement it into the protocol.
Yep, and I think this is a truly a nounish innovation, right? Because this is unlike, at least from what I've seen, unlike any other community, Web3 community has done. So my last question on this, and then we'll move on. So in terms of timeline, I remember that it was mentioned that it could go into effect maybe on New Year's Eve. But when do you think we should have that? Should we have that as soon as we have the audits completed, or what is a reasonable timeline in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think one answer is, it should be implemented as soon as possible, for the reason that, I think the biggest problem that it solves is not necessarily arbitrage, which is
Hmm.
like kind of all wrapped up in there. But the biggest problem that it solves is like once again opening up the DAO to one new member every day. Because the problem that we have currently is that people aren't really bidding on membership per se. They're bidding on the treasury, and as long as that's the case, the DAO doesn't get one new member every day, which I think that sort of like attention aggregating mechanism is like a super important thing for the DAO, but both in terms of momentum and getting stuff done, but also in terms of like very practical stuff like DAO security, front ends, like having like kind of aggregating that brain power, and having like people that are engaged and invested in the project, and like kind of renewing that engagement and investment on a regular basis. Like that's one of the reasons that it's so important to have these new members every day. So I think that's one reason that it's kind of like fairly urgent to solve the arbitrage problem, and the burn seems like the best solution to that problem. I would say the only caveat there is that with all of this sort of protocol engineering, it always feels to me like there's a sense in which slower is better. And
Hmm.
again, that's part of the motivation around one noun every day is like, this is a game that evolves in slow motion because all of this stuff is novel, and a lot of the changes that we make are permanent, and there's a lot of capital at stake, and so like doing things slowly is important, and I think a major sort of benefit of doing things slowly is just sort of having time to really like contemplate the implications of any change that we make. Like I think I think this is true of decision making generally, like in your own life or whatever. That idea of like let's sleep on it. Like individually, when you give yourself time to make a decision, your brain is kind of like doing things in the background, that gets surfaced to your sort of like conscious mind, and there's no sort of like shortcut there. It's just like stewing on things does produce a kind of insight that kind of like rapid decision making doesn't produce. And I think that's probably true of these like ecosystems as well. Like even the idea of forking, like intuitively, initially was like very distasteful to me, and then sort of like the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And so like intuitively, the burn seems to make a lot of sense, but like if we don't give it at least a few weeks to kind of like stew on it, and try to understand what the long-term implications are, it's possible that kind of like rushing to implement it is a mistake. So I think we sort of have to strike the balance between those two things: the sort of urgency of getting new members into the DAO, and then also the kind of like just the need for people to kind of like absorb this new game mechanic and understand the implications.
Yep. And I, now I want to talk a bit about the communications, which we have alluded to a bit earlier. So almost a year ago, you and some other nanners decided to kill the Discord. And then can you talk a bit about what happened since then? And do you think nannish communication today has become a bit more decentralized? Because this Farcaster channel phenomenon has only happened in the recent months, right? So there has been a prolonged period of time where the Discord was killed, but not a lot of conversation were happening on Farcaster, probably in other newly formed Discord. So can you talk about sort of what happened in the past 10, 11 months?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's basically been like a long sort of recovery of the communication channels for the DAO. I think we're probably just getting to a point now where there's sort of like um, a healthy ecosystem for communication. I think in sort of like the in the vacuum of like the death of the original quote unquote official Discord, um, there was a fairly strong desire within the community to sort of like recreate that space. along with all of its toxicity, and I think that that sort of happened. And I think it's sort of difficult to kind of like separate um, the kind of animosity around people having different visions for where the DAO should go, and like the sort of like vibes of the communication channels, and so like it's kind of like those sort of bad vibes are gone, and at the same time we're now starting to see a sort of like healthier blossoming of like multiple productive chat rooms or kind of communication channels for the DAO. So I'm not sure, like it's hard to know to what extent those things are connected, if it would have happened anyway. Um, but in general, I would say that this, as we were saying kind of before we got started, this idea of like, how do you do the social layer in these sort of like permissionless orgs? It feels sort of to me like an unsolved problem. I think like you have like the simple solutions are obviously the centralized solution, which we rejected, and then the sort of state we're in now, where there are these sort of like public channels that are kind of like not that interesting, and there are these private channels that are very productive and very interesting, but are by nature gated, and so like not everyone can participate. And so you can kind of have this like two-tiered system that emerges, um, where you could have like DAO members who are members of the DAO or members of the protocol, but not necessarily members of like the rooms where the most sort of important decisions are being made, or the sort of like the culture is being formed. And so I guess like Farcaster is a nice, and I think this is part of the reason that the community is sort of gravitating here now,
Mm-hmm.
is like, it has some of the it's something new. It has properties of being public and private, because of you can sort of like curate your feed. You can kind of like dip into the channels that are interesting to you, but the conversation is still happening in public. So yeah, I think it's kind of a very fluid situation, and it's only now kind of getting to a point where it seems interesting and maybe a little bit healthier.
Yeah. But before this conversation, I realized that you were very early on Farcaster. Your Farcaster ID is less than 200, which means that you got there at the very early days. And I also realized that you were not very active in the first year or so. So to talk about, why do you think there's this recent surge in sort of non-niche activities on Farcaster, and do you think that is sustainable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I hope it's sustainable. It's certainly like it again, it seems to be a nice it seems to be like the place where you can have the most productive conversation in public. So I think there are more productive conversations that are happening in private. I think there are places that people are kind of like paying more attention to that are in public, but I don't think like I think Farcaster like has this sort of nice kind of combination of both of these properties. So I mean, to the extent that that continues to be true, I think conversations will continue to happen on Farcaster. I think like also this like the addition of channels seems like it's very like a very nice feature of the platform, and I personally think like Farcaster becomes a more and more interesting place the more it sort of differentiates itself from Twitter. It like I think initially when it just felt like it initially felt to me like a distillation of like Twitter that was only crypto Twitter. And I think the interesting thing about Twitter is like, or X or whatever, is having like the juxtaposition of all the things that you're interested kind of like streaming by. And so I just had trouble kind of getting engaged there when it was like only crypto subject
Mm-hmm.
matter. Um, and I think I mean, channels sort of like encode that into the protocol a little bit more, but somehow it works better, because now like when I go there, I know I'm going there for nouns specifically. So yeah, it's this kind of like nice middle space between Discord and Twitter, which I think could be quite valuable.
Yeah. And I remember Seneca casted about this the other day. He's planning to create a round to encourage more builders to build at the intersection of nouns and Farcaster. So, talk about what do you think are some of the infrastructure or some sort of clients that need to be built in order for us to leverage Farcaster to the fullest extent possible.
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer there. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think the place I'm kind of like the thing I've always been most interested in with respect to nouns has been the sort of like open source brand building and like the creation of content around the open source brand. And I'm super excited that other people are excited about kind of like funding and building infrastructure around the brand, but I just like uh, I just don't have a ton of expertise there, I'm not really a specialist there. So I can sort of speculate, but I think there are probably better people to talk to about like you know um, yeah, kind of building Farcaster clients.
And all kinds of proliferation work that we can do. There has been a lot of new proposals since the fork, and a lot of new things are being worked on, as we speak. So, can you talk about, some of the things that you're most sort of looking forward to in season three? Could be the proposal that have been, funded already, or some things that you think should be funded.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, a couple of the props that I'm very excited about. Um, One I would say is the I guess it's a candidate currently, but the stupid buddy proposal to kind of scale and kind of uh, re, yeah grow their shorts program.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure. Did you see any of the short films that came out of their previous proposal? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a problem that kind of needs to be worked on. But in terms of like distributing the outputs of these proposals, but the sort of like the quality of animation that came out of that proposal, and the sort of quality of engagement between the artist community and the nouns community, I think was just off the charts. Like I think um, it's of course difficult to measure things in the nouns ecosystem, and we have this like in the absence of being able to measure, we sort of like default to like how many views something got, or like like some sort of like social media like metric of how many people saw X or Y. But I think just in terms of like pure cultural impact and kind of like impact at the point of um, like people that work in industry and like could want to make stuff with nouns, and like people who it's exciting to get them engaged around nouns. I think this was kind of like one of the most important proposals that's taken place. So I think the idea that of kind of like scaling that and trying to be more ambitious and make more short films about nouns, and make longer short films about nouns, and engage like kind of producers and executives within sort of the Hollywood ecosystem, to like participate and work on the project, I think is very, very exciting. So that's one of the props that I'm most excited about. Um, and then I would say the other one is like, or the other sort of theme that I'm very excited about. We've only seen one proposal so far, but I expect we'll see more shortly. Is this idea of the DAO sort of like redistributing the nouns in the treasury that it of course accumulated because of the fork, redistributing those nouns to kind of like people in the nouns ecosystem, um, retroactively funding people with nouns for work that they've done for the nouns ecosystem, and just generally trying to grow the network in a very sort of intentional way. And especially now, while the DAO sort of can't acquire new members in the daily auctions because of the sort of arbitrage problem that we just discussed. I think sort of the DAO, like intentionally growing the network, and kind of like picking and choosing, influential or kind of like interesting people that would be great to have as members of the community. I think that's a very important thing to be doing.
Yeah, and you also you talked about how sort of nouns could work with other brands that may have sort of existing distributions, and there could be a potential collaboration with different types of um, existing brands for us to proliferate in the meme. But I'm curious, sort of from a brand building perspective. Um, what do you think are some of the brands that are more suitable for nouns to work with? What are some of the examples where we shouldn't really work with an existing brand? Because I know there are some proposals that's are about this type of theme, but it's not always a good fit.
Yeah, I, I think I actually think like most of the worst fits are like within crypto, and like a lot of the best fits are kind of like outside of the ecosystem. I think as long as the potential partner like gets it, like they understand what the brand is, what it means, what we're trying to do. I think there's like a super wide range of possible partners. Like even like the absurdist ones, like like baked beans. If that proposal ever gets delivered on, or the wet wipes, like that sort of thing. Like it has like a hilarious quality, and I think you sort of see other brands engaging kind of recently in that sort of like absurd like collaboration space. I can't remember what a good example was, but like you do see sort of like like Kraft dinner breakfast cereal, or like
Hmm.
brands sort of like poking fun at themselves. So I think like there's a huge range of possible collaborations that can happen. I think the only ones that I sort of get concerned about are like 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 crypto gambling, like DeFi yield farming, the sort of stuff that like we're trying, like the space is trying to transcend, and I think Nouns is kind of at the forefront of like trying to transcend. I think it sort of like uh, hurts the brand a little bit, or it hurts the idea that it's possible to transcend this stuff if we just keep getting like dragged back into it. So I'm really open for any form of collaboration, and I would advocate for any form of collaboration. With the exception of the things that sort of like already give crypto a bad name.
Yeah, speaking of yield farming, I remember you voted with reason on one of the recent yield farming proposals, and you said something like nouns represents a more noble vision of what crypto can become. So I actually want to spend the last maybe 5 to 10 minutes talk about sort of your original vision of nouns and how much of that do you think has been realized, since it was founded 2 years ago.
Yeah, sure. It's funny. The original vision. I mean, like, I think I guess as with any startup, your vision at the outset and your vision as you sort of like understand more what it is are kind of two different things. I think my vision at the outset was just like, oh, hey, this could be like a more full featured or more like crypto native crypto punks, which
Mm-hmm.
I think it is, but I think that the sort of like as the kind of NFT bubble bursts and it like it becomes apparent that there are so many more problems to be solved. The sort of like um, the impact of that idea, I think, like is not as significant as I thought it would be at the outset. But I think what has sort of like kind of grown in the sort of post FTX, like post NFT bubble era, is yes, this idea that like the Nouns brand is something that is like appealing enough, and like I don't know, it sort of it feels like it has this sort of like uh, optimism and like um, refinement and just overall feeling that does sort of transcend at least what we've seen in crypto so far. I mean, I think CryptoPunks do that to an extent as well. But I think what Nouns has, in addition to that feeling, is a set of mechanisms that can cause it to kind of like snowball, or like grow reflexively, and become something, you know first of all like Hello Kitty scale, and then eventually maybe sort of nation state scale. But I think that's maybe 10 or 20 years away, and that would also require very sort of like mainstream adoption of Bitcoin and Ethereum. So yeah, I think Nouns, I've said this before, and I don't know how many people know this reference, but um, the sort of like famous programming book, JavaScript, The Good Parts. And I was never a very good programmer. I read this book like 3 or 4 times, and I think I like bailed on it every single time I got to the chapter about closures. It was just like that was like that's like too hardcore for me. But anyway, I love the title of the book, JavaScript: The Good Parts. It implies that like the whole thing isn't perfect, but there are good parts of it, and I like to think of Nouns as like crypto, the good parts, right? Like, can you take the best that this space has to offer, and can you scale it, and can you make people care about it, and can you have a lot of fun doing it, and really make something beautiful. So that's mostly how I try to think about it.
Yeah, and one way that I often think about Nouns is it almost it is a project focused on public goods, but it also sort of offers status symbol and apply a text on those status symbols so that you could fund public goods. So I'm wondering, how much would you attribute the Nouns success to the sort of status as a service thesis, and to sort of offer a status symbol, not actually something that has visible utility, but a status symbol where people would actually pay for it and then get taxed, and then you can use the money to fund public goods. I don't know if that's it's just my understanding, but I'm curious to your reaction to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. I think things that are like really interesting, like you can typically like understand them many different ways at once, right? I think that's true of Bitcoin, Ethereum, hopefully Nouns, right? There's no like sort of like single understanding. Like, Ethereum is simultaneously like digital oil and the world computer. It's like you're using
Yeah.
all these different analogies to like try to like map the territory, right? And like each analogy gives you like a feel for a different part of it. So I think it was like Noun 40 that originally kind of articulated this idea, and I think
Yeah.
it's great. So yeah, I think Nouns can simultaneously be like this big open source brand with lots of like cartoons and stuff made about it, and then also this like digital original that is like a status symbol, that like when you buy it you're paying a tax, and that tax funds public goods. I think all of that is great. So I think those visions are sort of like two parts of like a much bigger thing. And of course, I think one just like we talked about, like the discords kind of competing in an attention meritocracy. I think like Nouns in a sense is like it's like a mission meritocracy, right? It's like the sub community with like the best, with the sort of most meritocratic vision for what this could be. Like they will kind of rise up and take over, and most of the votes will sort of propel it in that direction. So yeah, I think that's absolutely a valid kind of vision for the project, and I think it's like a very sort of like compelling use of like the NFT treasury kind of feedback loop, which really only Nouns has scaled so far, and so it's worth sort of exploring what that can do.
Yeah, and if we look into the next 5 to 10 or 15 years, um, in order for maybe each Nouns to become its own sort of network state or whatever you call it, what do you think needs to happen for Nouns to have a mainstream impact, and to basically have an impact on people beyond the nouns holders beyond Web3 community?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just going to depend on how crypto as a whole scales. But like, I think there's some sort of like key ingredients that seem like, or like truths that seem like will have to be in place for this to be very large, right? So like, what one of them is that the sort of like brand awareness needs to be very very significant. We have to be sort of like, again, Hello Kitty scale or larger, where like every time these glasses appear, people immediately sort of like connect it back to nouns, to the brand, to all of the stuff that's been created. I think it's probably the case that for this to happen, like the at least on some level, the sort of like attention NFT treasury feedback loop like has to actually work like we theorize it does. So if everybody in the world knows and cares about nouns, and there are however many billion, 10 billion people in the world at that point, and like only one noun per day, I think it probably has to be the case that, or it should be the case that winning the auction is a very significant kind of moment for somebody, and they're willing, they'll get a lot of attention and kind of like credibility and clout um, for bidding in the auction and winning the auction. And so I would expect that like the daily auction should be like a sort of like cultural phenomenon, right? Like a lot of people will want to uh, be watching the daily auction. It should be like a very interesting thing as to like who wins, and what's their acceptance speech, like who are they, and then I think the thing that comes with all of that sort of like attention and status should be that the nouns are expensive because there's a lot of demand and not a lot of supply, and so it becomes a very special thing to participate and win a noun, and I think that means that the treasury will have a very very large amount of capital in it, and then I think logically, like if nouns are a status symbol and the treasury has like huge amounts of capital, like many millions of dollars a day, or $1 million a day, something like that, that like the things that we can fund become very ambitious, and I think our ambitions will sort of like naturally exceed like putting the noggles on the Las Vegas sphere or whatever, right? Like there will be a sort of like natural progression from like we've achieved maximum awareness to like now it's time to achieve maximum kind of like impact in the public goods funding. So I think that's the sort of mature state of things that I think is very attainable, but I also think it can sort of only scale as fast as crypto scales. Or maybe we can be riding the crest of the wave to the extent that we think nouns is this sort of like crypto the good parts, but it's sort of like it requires nouns to do its best, and then also the rest of the space to scale as well.
Absolutely. I have 10 different topics that I want to get into, but I also want to be conscious of the time here, because initially we said 30 to 40 minutes, and we're at the 40-minute mark. So do you have anything else that we haven't covered but you want to say to the nouns/Farcaster community? Any last words that we should cover?
Last words. I mean, I don't. I would just maybe reemphasize the importance of sort of like solving the kind of arbitrage slash like people bidding on the treasury instead of the membership problem. I think that's probably like the most pressing problem facing nouns at the moment. Like I think we can always have like, well, there's time to have better proposals, there's time to have more funds in the treasury, there's time to like figure out everything else, but like the way we get there, the way we figure all of that out is with like really really smart people who really care. And nouns is special because it has that already, right? Like there are so many sort of like big brains in the community, but there's some level of attrition. People burn out, they get bored, they want to work on other things. their attention is split. And so it's like it's really, really important to be continuously refreshing that pool and not stagnating. And it's been the case for the last almost year that because of the sort of arbitrage that we haven't been refreshing that kind of like pool of nounish brain power. And I think it's pretty important that we start doing that again just as soon as we can. So I think that's the reason to kind of like move quickly on the burn mechanism. We're redistributing nouns, or really doing whatever we can to like get the auction price to a place where people are not bidding on the
Yeah.
treasury, but they're bidding on membership in the org.
Yeah, and thank you so much. There are so many other things that I would love to touch on if we had more time. But, I think it's time to wrap up this conversation. And I really, really appreciate your time today for 156. If you're available in the future, we can do a round two. But this has been fantastic. I learned so much. Thank you again, and I will see you on Farcaster.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and let's definitely do it again.
All right.
Cheers. Thanks for hosting.
Cheers.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.